This lecture will be looking at the pre-modern Korean Catholic archives. And that seems maybe perhaps oddly specific for our class. This is an introductory to public history class. But I want to talk about this particular archives because it's one that I have some connection with that I've used in my own research, which focuses on the religious history of Korea. So I have some experience with it, and I think I can therefore better talk about it and also introduce some of the issues regarding archives and how they impact how we write history. Because it's often the archives that preserve particular documents, and if we don't have access to those documents, then we can't write our history, and the documents they choose to preserve or that they're able to preserve impact the sort of history that we write. So this lecture has several purposes. First of all, as I mentioned previously, these archives are ones I have personal experience with, so I think I can talk a little bit more about them. And I think the peculiar aspects of those archives are interesting in and of themselves, but also what I say about them can also apply to other archives too. And there's also several questions I want to kind of try and answer. So the first is how, by whom, and under what conditions were documents related to Catholicism produced and preserved in Korea? How were archives established for those documents, by whom, and for what purpose, right? So people choose to write certain things, and they're not necessarily thinking historically. They're writing certain things, oftentimes just about what they're up to and what they've been doing and that sort of thing. And some of those things get preserved and some do not. And the question is why and by whom, why does a particular person write down a certain thing? And that shapes history, right? Because if they don't write down those things, we don't necessarily know that they happened. And then how were archives established to preserve those documents? Who established them and for what purpose, right? So you have there's a finite amount of documents that are produced and are able to be preserved, and then a certain number of those documents survive and are selected to be preserved by different archives. And their decisions that they make a lot of times have to do with the reason why the archives was established in the first place. And then based on what documents are preserved and made public in these archives, that helps determine the narratives that can be told, right? So what narratives have been established by the archives, by whom, and for what purpose? And I'm going to be coming back to these questions throughout. And in this lecture, when I talk about archives, it can mean multiple things. It can mean a particular, and there's two particular definitions I want to focus on. Archives can just refer to a particular institution that holds documents and preserves them and makes them makes them available to the public. But also archives can just refer to the totality of knowledge about a particular area. And I will try and make it clear which one I'm referring to at any particular point. So one thing that's interesting about the Korean Catholic archives is that, and I want to stress I'm talking about the pre-modern Korean Catholic archives. So I'm talking about from about the 18th century when Catholicism first came into Korea till about 1886, which is when Korea signed a treaty with France that said that gave a kind of religious tolerance. And between that period from late 18th century till about 1886, Korean or Catholics in Korea could face persecution, right? They were several thousand would in fact be killed by the government in that time period. So I just want to stress when I'm talking about the Korean Catholic archives, I'm talking about the pre-modern one, the early ones. There's ones that occur later, but I'm talking about these the documents that are produced during this time period and then are archived. So one thing that's interesting about these archives is the diversity of sources. There are a lot of different kinds of sources. There are government documents that criticize Catholicism. There are documents by private scholars who criticize Catholicism, say it's an evil religion, say it's bad, and so they're very much in opposition to Catholicism. You also have books coming from China. That's how Koreans were first exposed to Catholicism. There were Catholic missionaries in China, and they wrote things down in Chinese, and educated Koreans could read Chinese. And so they would get some of those books, and that's eventually what led some of them to convert to Catholicism. So you have books and you have lots of different sources in that sense. And a lot of those books are just explaining what Catholicism is, explaining different a little bit about doctrines of the church. There's prayer books. There's things like that. But there's also letters. There's letters written between Korean Catholics amongst themselves. There's letters written between foreign missionaries and Korean Catholics. There's letters written between foreign missionaries and people in Europe. There's letters between Korean priests and European priests. There's all sorts of very interesting, very fascinating sources. And these, like I said, these appear in a lot of different languages. So if you look at the document on the left, that is written in Chinese. The document on the right, though, is written in Korean. And also, those sources show you something about the different languages that are being used, right? The one in the left is in Chinese, and the one in the right is in Korean. And you can tell, even if you don't know Chinese or Korean, these are clearly two different languages, right? The writing looks very, very different. Now, one thing you can't tell from those sources, but I can tell you from being familiar with the sources, and this adds to the kind of richness and diversity of these sources, is the amount of collaboration that had to take place. So what would happen, for example, the one on the left that was written in Chinese, it was brought into Korea. It was written probably by a Western missionary and a Chinese person, and then it was brought to Korea by Koreans, and like I said, educated Koreans could read it, but uneducated Koreans could not. They would know how to read Korean, but not Chinese. So it was very quickly translated into Korean, so those Koreans could in fact read it. So there was this kind of working together between these different groups of people. And to show you how complex that could be, the document on the right, that one was originally, what happened was a Western missionary, well, let me start over. That's called the Kihei Ilgi. That was written in 1839, or it was based rather on the 1839 persecution. There was a persecution in 1839 by the government that killed several hundred Catholics. And a French missionary, a bishop in fact, started gathering documents related to and information from witnesses and things about those martyrs. He's worked on that for a while, but then he realized he was probably going to be arrested, so he handed it over to some Korean Catholics, and they continued to work on it. They gave it to another bishop. He translated it into French and then sent it to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, a Korean Catholic priest translated it into Latin and sent it on to Europe. So you can see that kind of collaboration there. You can see the different languages there. But guess what? There's a bunch of different versions of that text, right? And also the other texts. There's Korean versions, there's Chinese versions, there's French versions, there's Latin versions. Some of them we know existed, but maybe don't exist anymore. Others do continue to exist. And then there's multiple versions within the language. And it's important to know which version you're looking at. But that gives you some idea of the different kinds of sources that are being produced and the richness behind those sources, the different viewpoints that are there. One thing also I want to point out, though, that I think is we need to also understand that makes Korean Catholic archives a little bit different. Usually archives are documents that were produced for very practical purposes, very this-worldly purposes. So, for example, if you want to do research on land in South Carolina, you would go to the South Carolina archives, and they have records of all these different land transactions. And using those records, you could see how new land was opened up. You could trace the people who owned the land and things like that. The purpose, though, of those documents was not for historians. The purpose of making those documents was to know who owned what land and who owed taxes on that land and who could sell that land and whom they could sell it to and things like that. But historians can use those sources now to understand what was going on at that time period. But notice those sources are very this-worldly. They're interested in land, right, and land transactions. We can use them in different ways, but it's focused on this-worldly interests. The Catholic archives of Korea were very, very different. And you'll notice on the left I had the word salvation written. So basically all the documents that were written, most of the documents that were written, were meant to help people go to heaven. That was the point of it, making books about Catholic doctrine, talking about Jesus. They translated excerpts of the Bible, lives of saints, that kind of thing. The purpose was to help people have salvation. So that affects, those are the kinds of documents that are produced, and those are the kind of documents the archives will therefore be able to preserve, right? You can't preserve something if it doesn't exist. So Korean Catholics are not primarily interested in this worldly things. They're interested in going to heaven. And so those are the kinds of documents they produce. Similarly, on the right, like I said, I have the word sainthood, and that's definitely definitely an otherworldly thing, right? That's talking about people who are believed to be in heaven. And that was the whole point of that book, the Kihei Ilgi, this journal of 1839 that I just talked about, was to produce evidence of martyrs so that they could be recognized as saints. Right? The idea in Catholicism is that if someone is a very virtuous person, it's believed that they might be with God in heaven interceding for other people, and one way to get there, of course, would be martyrdom. And so if you can prove that someone died a martyr, and a martyr is someone who dies for Jesus in this context, if you can prove that, there's a good chance that they're in heaven, and then they can be recognized as a saint. So a lot of the records, the documents that were produced, were trying to prove that a particular person existed and that they died for Jesus and therefore could conceivably be recognized as a saint. Right, so those are the different documents that are being produced. So it's not very this worldly. It's really focused on trying to get people into heaven or proving that someone is in heaven. And I really want to highlight this point about there being multiple different perspectives. And I can do this just actually by showing you one particular text. And that is the History of the Korean Church, which was written in 1874 by a French missionary. He'd never actually been to Korea, but he had been a missionary in India, and he was in France recovering from illness. A man named Father Charles Dallet, and he collected he had all these letters and reports written by French missionaries who were working in Korea, and also they sent him some government documents that were produced by the Koreans government, and he used that to write a book about the history of the Korean Church, and it's a very interesting book. And he uses all these different sources from Koreans, sources from missionaries, and of course government sources, Korean government sources. And then to again show you the kind of the life of the text, on the right is a modern translation of that book into Korean. And that text is interesting because the author is a little bit critical and shows at point. He has added footnotes to the translation showing where the first author, Charles Dallet, made some mistakes. And he's able to do that because he has access to government reports that Charles Dallet did not have. So you have this interesting layering, these different multiple perspectives in just this one text because of the added translations, the annotations made possible by an archives, right? And this is one thing we have to keep in mind. Even if someone is honest, they can be incorrect. And Charles Dallet was an honest historian, priest, but he did make some mistakes, and he didn't have access to particular records that would have shown him that he was mistaken. But this other Catholic priest who translated his work, Father Che So-gu, he did have that information. He could make those corrections. Now, one thing that we have to really understand, right, is how particular historical circumstances shape the archives. Right now, we're still in the kind of the stage talking about how they shape the documents, but we'll also see more clearly how they shape the archives shortly. And one of the key things about the Korean Catholic archives is violence. Catholicism was an illegal religion in Korea. Thousands of Catholics were killed by the government, including not only Koreans, but French missionaries. And that's what this image is depicting. It says 3 French missionaries who were executed in 1839. And it's very difficult to find a document about Korean Catholicism from the 19th century that is not indirectly or directly related to violence, right? A large number of the documents are written about martyrs, about people who are being killed by the government. And even when people are not writing about martyrs directly, there is still this kind of this understanding that they have to stay hidden, that they have to be quiet, because they're Catholics and it's an illegal religion, and if the government finds out about them, they could be killed, right? So this violence really shapes this archive. And what happens is, though, because there's so much focus on the violence, on the martyrs, because that shapes the documents, it's easy to get to be kind of confused and to be sort of tricked, because most of the time Catholics weren't being actively persecuted. Right, only maybe about 1/10 of the time in that century were Korean Catholics actively being persecuted. But the existence of the persecutions were enough to cast a shadow over the entire time period. So if you read the documents, you may get the sense that Koreans were always being executed, that they were always being persecuted, because the documents focus on martyrs. But if you actually look at the years in which those people are being killed, it's only about 7 to 10 year range. It's just that there's always this understanding that these persecutions could come again. So again, that's how the documents kind of shape how we understand the history. And what happens then is you have documents that are produced by the government, And most of the government documents are focused on persecuting Catholics. You can find a lot of documents of the government interrogating Catholics, and occasionally there'll be a pause and it'll say, we ask the Catholic this question, and then we hit him 30 times, and then we ask him another question. So those, even though they're not talking about someone being killed, they are violent. And then there's a lot of government documents that just talk about the kind of nuts and bolts of carrying out a religious persecution, just all the difficulties they have in trying to arrest people and so forth, in identifying different people and trying to figure out if someone really is Catholic or not. And then the government will also produce documents saying that why persecution was okay, why it was right and good that they should persecute people. And I actually wrote an article about this because they were killing, young children, some as young as like 10 or 11, 12, and killing elderly people. Sometimes people in the 60s or 70s would be executed. And it's kind of hard to accept that. So they had to convince people why it was okay for them to kill them. But again, the focus is on violence, right? So like I said, you get this idea by looking at these archives that Catholics were always being persecuted because all the documents relate to violence, but they did a lot of other things other than being persecuted. And they most of them survived. Most of them were not martyred, but that's not the feeling you get from reading the documents. And key to why this is the case, as I said before, but I really want to stress again, is the focus is on proving is on recording these different martyrs, showing that this person from the Catholic perspective, that this person existed, that this person was executed or otherwise died because of their faith, and because of that they should be recognized as a saint. And that's the job of a historian, right? And of the historical method to figure out, did a particular person exist? Did they die or not? What was the manner of their death? Did they die apparently or did they die because of their faith in Jesus? And you need to establish all those things in order for someone to become or to be rather recognized as a saint. And that image there, that's a ceremony from St. Peter's Church, Basilica, in 1968, and you can see on the left that's the Korean Cardinal Stephen Kim Soo-hwan, and this is a ceremony recognizing some of the Korean martyrs as blessed. This occurred in 1968, and that's a stage that you go through before you become a full-fledged saint, as you're a blessed, and that means you're kind of still under investigation. But this was a big ceremony that was celebrated in honor of these, or to recognize these people becoming blessed. But what I have this picture here is for us to focus on is in the 19th century, when people were writing down stuff about the martyrs and making these documents, their focus was trying to prove that these people should become saints. And so what happens is we know a lot about the martyrs. We know a lot about people who were killed. And in fact, it's hard to find a document written in the 19th century by someone in Korea who's Catholic who wasn't at some point martyred, right? Most of the authors of the documents during this time period who were writing about martyrs, they themselves will be martyred if they're in Korea. What this does, though, it creates us, if you want to understand about the martyrs during this time period, there's a whole bunch of wonderful sources. But if you want to understand something else, it's very difficult. And if you read the documents, you get the sense that every Catholic was martyred, and that's just not the case. Some Catholics, perhaps at times the majority, would actually agree to give up their faith rather than be executed, and then they would be let go or sent into exile. And some of those really did give up their faith. Others did not. They just didn't want to get killed, so they pretended to. And then still others never actually were arrested, right? But because of the focus of the documents, right, the focus of trying to prove that these people were martyrs, that meant that people wrote down that kind of thing, but they didn't write down other kinds of things. And it gives us kind of a misunderstanding of the time. We don't want to think everyone was a martyr. But at the same time, so on one side, it's great. We can understand a lot about the martyrs because that's what people are writing about. But we're kind of limited in what we can understand about other areas. So that's how the documents are kind of put together. Now, how about the formation of the archives? Well, one thing we have to stress in the 19th century in Korean Catholicism, the leaders of the community, when they were around, they weren't always around because they were oftentimes killed by the government, were European priests, right? European missionaries. And those are the ones who took the lead in sending documents from principally about the martyrs, but also just general reports about what was going on in the Korean Catholic Church. Those people were sending that information to Europe, right? They were sending that information to Europe. So a lot of the Korean Catholic archives first appear under European leadership, and they're documents that are being sent to various archives in Europe. Places like the various missionary orders, they have their own archives. The Vatican has its own archives. There's multiple different kind of organizations within the Vatican that each have their own archives. And so it was interesting, and because Catholicism was being persecuted in Korea in the 19th century, the primary archives about Catholicism in Korea were not in Korea, they were in Europe, right? And they were therefore under European leadership. Now, there would be a shift, though, and a formation of what I call a peninsular archives, and by that I mean the Korean peninsula, under Korean leadership. And that has a lot to do with this man on the left, Father Andrew Chae Sogu, who actually I met, though he was in his 80s when I met him. But after the Korean War, he actually became a priest before the Korean War, and then after the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 53, he was sent to Europe to study. And it's interesting because he studied church history and history in general, but he studied at the first university he studied in Belgium, where he got a master's degree, was a Catholic university. The second university he studied at in Germany was a secular university. And so it made him kind of an interesting historian and something of an archivist. We'll talk about momentarily, because he was he had theological training because he was a priest, but he also was very much interested because of his secular education in making sure that Korean Catholic history was carried out in a critical, academic, scholarly way, and was based very closely on written sources, on good historical documentation, following all the normal standards of history, right? So he wanted, like I said, he was a devout Catholic. He had theological training. He was interested in church history, but he thought it was very important that church history follow the rules of standard academic secular scholarship. And what he did then when he came back from from Europe to Korea, he was asked, he made some connections, and he talked about his concerns to the Archbishop of Korea at the time, Bishop No Ki Nam, and he said to him, I'd like to carry out this study. And Bishop No Ki Nam actually had a large number of documents that he needed archiving. He had all these documents, but no one was trained to take care of them. And Father Chae Sogu, when he was in Europe, had made all these, had gained experience working in archives. He'd actually made all these copies of European documents and brought them back to Korea and would help translate them. Right, and based on that, the Archbishop gave him his support, and that allowed Bishop No Ki Nam, Father Chae Sogu, to establish the Institute for Research of Korean Church History, or in Korean, the Hanguk Kyoesa Yongguso, and he founded that in 1964. And its purpose was to essentially start establishing a peninsular archives. Right, he's gonna put all those documents that the bishop wanted in there. Those are going to be in there, but he also includes a lot of documents that he had copied in European archives. Right, so now you're going to start having Koreans developing their own archives, right, under Korean direction in Korea. Right, so it's going to be that's going to lead to a kind of transformation, because whereas Europeans, missionaries, are really, really interested in how these documents relate to theological issues, Koreans, the Korean Catholics are still Catholic. They want to show their history theologically, but because they are Korean, they want to show that they are a part of the nation. And it's kind of tricky, right? Because the government had persecuted them for like 100 years. But now they want to show that, hey, we're a part of the country too. We have made our historical contributions. And that's not something the Europeans have been particularly interested in, right? But Koreans want to show that Korean Catholicism was good for Koreans throughout their history, right? And that's going to be one thing that Father Chae Sogu wants to do with the archive. So he has a lot he's trying to do, right? He wants to follow good academic scholarship. He wants to make the he wants though to that archives to show that the church, that good academic scholarship, to show that the Catholic Church has played an important and a positive role in Korean history. And I should stress that this institute over time becomes huge, right? If you look on the right picture there, you can see That's the main Catholic church in Korea, Myeongdong Songdong, the Myeongdong Cathedral. If one thing that's interesting, during the democratization in Korea in like the 70s and 80s, that was a favorite place for protesters to go because the church would protect them as those protesters demanded democracy and human rights. But to the left, if you come down those steps and you turn right and cross the street, you go to the building on the left. And that's where the Church History Foundation is today. It occupies the third and fourth floors of that building. And it has about a dozen staff, and it has an archives that you can go to. It publishes a bunch of journals and things like that. So now you have in Korea, Korean archives run by Koreans about Catholicism in Korea. And it's something that the Catholic Church takes very seriously and puts a lot of resources behind. Now, one thing we also have to stress is how, first of all, the Research Foundation of Korean Church History is not the only one. It's just the major one. It's the most important one, but there's lots of different associations. And one thing they do is try and make the archives available. And this is where the meaning of the word archives becomes quite complex, right? Usually archives, we think of, it's an institution that you go to and then you look at documents. But what happens if they put those documents online? Well, okay, you go to the institution's website. It's still kind of connected to the institution. One thing, though, that they've been doing, these various history institutions dedicated to Catholic Church history, is to produce documents and sell them at low prices so that anyone can get them. So, for example, there's the document on the left is called the Sahak Chingwi, and it's a Korean government document from the year 1801 that provides that's a collection of information about Catholics who were arrested in the persecution of that time period, and it's a very, very important resource. But it's written in Chinese. It's not always, the Chinese is sometimes a little bit difficult to read. It's tricky. So what one institution did was they produced their own version of it, where they basically have if you buy that book and you look inside of it, it has the original Chinese like copies. Then it has a Korean translation of the Chinese, and it has annotations and an introductory essay to help you understand the document, right? And similarly, the document on the right, that is the letters that were sent to the Bishop of Korea, sent by a Bishop of Korea to his family back in France. They have translated those from French into Korean. So it's interesting. I can't read French, so I actually use these French translations, these Korean translations of French documents. So what's key here is this kind of blurs the line between the archives, because you do not have to go to an archives anymore to look at these documents. You don't need to go to France. You can be in Greenwood, South Carolina, like me, and do research on Korean Catholicism because they want to make the archives available. And these books are not cheap. These books are not expensive. They're actually very cheap. Right? You can actually buy these books at very, very low prices. Those two books together cost about $40 or $50, and they're big books. So there's this interest in making these archives available so that not only do you don't have to go to Europe, you don't even have to go to Korea to get access to these resources. You just have to get these books, and what you could do through interlibrary loan and things like that, or do what I do whenever I'm in Korea. I buy stuff, or my friends buy it, and they bring it back for me. But this blurs the line of the archives, and it's making these archival documents much more widely available. Now, why are they doing this, right? And I know you can't, most of you will probably not be able to read Korean, but I just wanted to kind of show this to you. This is from the Korean Church History Foundation's homepage, and they tell you what the purpose of their institute is. And it's very interesting because if you look at the first few items, number one is just saying to support the study of church history. Number two says, this is where the archives come in, to collect, organize, and translate materials related to church history. The third one says to publish materials related to church history. The fourth one is to have lectures on it. The fifth one is to have support for scholarships. So it's kind of interesting, right? This seems kind of neutral. It's this idea of, hey, we're going to try and make this stuff available, and here it goes. Do research on it, right? And it's complex, though, because number 6 says to carry out work connected to the exaltation of the martyrs, right? To carry out work dedicated to the exaltation of the martyrs. Now, that kind of makes sense because remember I said earlier that the documents in the archives focus on martyrs because that's what they're writing about, because they want to see if they could become saints. However, that creates an issue in history, right? Secular history is we're supposed to be kind of challenging things. We're supposed to be very scholarly and very critical. We're not usually supposed to exalt things, but the purpose of this archives is to exalt the martyrs. And that could cause some problems, right? You can think about the kind of issues that you might face if you're going to take a more critical approach to the martyrs. Now, the Institute has decided to be open, and they can't really do much to you if you decide to take a critical approach. But you can kind of see that they have this idea here that that's what they want to encourage, is people to take a positive approach to Catholicism in Korea, in part to show that it has been a positive force in Korean history. And one thing that we've kind of talked about so far as we've discussed public history is it's important that you be aware of the various tensions that you're going to face, the complex issues, right? Do not go into public history if you don't like people, because you're going to be dealing with people oftentimes in very tense situations, and where you're trying to help balance things. So this is another, to give you kind of an example of this. This is an image of the head of the Board of Trustees for the Church History Institute. And you can tell this is a cleric, but in fact, he's a bishop, right? He is a bishop. And so the head of the Institute, of the Board of Trustees, in a sense, the board is a bishop. And it's interesting because even though it is headed by the bishop, it also says in this webpage, it says that the Hanguk Kyoisa Yongguso, the Korean Church History Foundation, is a Chedanbopin, which means basically an independent corporation. So it's not a church organization. It has no formal connection to the Catholic Church, but the head of it, the board, is a bishop. And to kind of emphasize that point further, the actual head of the institute, which would be below the board, but the person in charge of the day-to-day running of the institute, is a priest. And I'm not trying to be critical. I'm not attacking this organization. I have a lot to actually do with them. Whenever I'm in Korea, I visit them, and I have friends who work there. Rather, I'm just trying to show the kind of complex issue that archives and people doing research face. Naturally speaking, when you are part of an archives and you have documents, for the most part, you want people to use the documents to say positive things about the people in those documents, right? For example, if you go to the Harry Truman Library, they and do research on Harry Truman, they would be happier if you were sympathetic to Truman at least. You don't have to be glowing about him, but it's kind of the thing. They're about Harry Truman. They want him to look at least halfway decent. And I'm just picking that name just kind of randomly, but that's just how things are, right? But here, this tension is even stronger because they want to be good historians, do good critical research. That means they have to be independent. But also they do want to make sure that the church has some kind of control, some kind of influence to make sure the documents are used in a particular way. So you got this very interesting situation where you have a formally independent organization that has these people in it who are either authorities in the Catholic Church or are people who are subject to church discipline, right? So this creates some kind of interesting issues. And I just want you to kind of think about and be aware about such things, because you may face similar issues when you're working at or for an archive. So this, again, raises kind of a complex issue. How do you engage with scholars and scholarship in this way, right? How do you do research at such an archives? How do you work at such an archives? How do you stay loyal to your archives mission? In this case, perhaps exalting the martyrs, right? While also being a good critical historian. And it's not an easy thing to do. And I wish I could tell you directly, just how you would do it, like instructions, but it's something you just have to kind of learn on your own, and you have to be sensitive to other people. You have to kind of understand, okay, who's this person? What are they doing here? What are they trying to accomplish, right? You got to kind of think about that. And you got to think, okay, how much can I help this person do what they're trying to do so that they'll help me try to do what I'm trying to do, with all of us being authentic and being moral, right? How can I, on one side I have to be practical, I have to work with people, but the other side I have to keep true to my principles, right? And you have to kind of think about that as you work in archives and do archival research. And to kind of give you a concrete example of this engagement, this presentation, or this lecture, is based on a presentation I gave at the Center for Korean Research at Columbia University. And there is it was at a workshop on the pre-modern Korean archives, right? And there on the left, I want to include her. That's Dr. Jung Won Kim, who was kind enough to invite me and to organize the workshop and pay our expenses so that we could go to Columbia University, which was very, very nice. And there's me on the right actually presenting at the workshop. And in a sense, the way you engage is you engage. You go out and you talk to people. I presented my work, and they gave me lots of good advice on how it could be used and how I could improve my paper, which they eventually will hopefully publish after I make revisions. But also I was able to take my perspective and share it with them based on their papers. And their papers were not on Catholicism. It was just on the archives in pre-modern Korea, basically before 1876. But we shared our ideas and we contributed to each other. And just getting out there trying to be good historians, we were able to share ideas and to help each other improve our work. And so that's, you engage by engaging. You talk to people, you listen to them. And if you listen to them, you can kind of help them because you can give them good advice and they'll help you and give you good advice. I got a huge amount of good advice on how to improve my paper on the pre-modern Korean Catholic archives by people who were not working on Catholicism at all. And it was a similar way back. I was able to give back as well, even on areas not necessarily connected to Korean Catholicism. So it's just something to think about as you do your work, to be there, to engage with people, to listen to them, and to contribute what you can. And I had to include this picture. This shows what I wanted you to kind of see what academics do. And you can kind of see this connection between, we talked about earlier how there's this connection between, or these differences between public history and academic history, but there's also strong connections, right? This whole workshop was about the archives. And here we all are, a group of people studying Korea, talking and thinking and discussing with each other. And this was a workshop, not exactly a conference. Those people all there were either people who presented a paper or people who were discussants about the paper. And we represented a lot of different institutions. There were people from Stanford, from Princeton, from Harvard, from the University of British Columbia, and of course from Columbia University, all there kind of sharing our ideas. And I thought that was kind of a funny picture because we look all very serious there, but we had a good time. We learned a lot from each other, but that's the kind of thing we professors do when we're not teaching classes. Just as an aside, one kind of funny thing I want to point out, in that picture, there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm only counting, there's 6 Korean professors. 5 of them were named Kim. So it was constantly Professor Kim, Dr. Kim, Professor Kim, Dr. Kim. Usually it doesn't happen like that, but it happened there. Kim is a very common Korean name. But I hope that gave you kind of an image of the nuts and bolts of how the archives work and how we engage with the archives and how the archives shape history, and a better idea about the connection between what public historians do by forming and preserving archives and making them available, and how we academic historians use that work to do what we do, to teach, to do research. And of course, remember, as a public historian, you will also maybe do archival work and share what you learn with others, including with academic historians.